Give me a sec here. I'm getting wired up if you were wondering what I'm doing. Good morning. Good to see you. Thank you. Nate, I love it when he plays guitar. I love that sound. Welcome guests that were here. Good to see you as well. In the very, very back row is a guy who's got a big beard. He's back there. There's two guys in red shirts. The one has no beard. But don't get discouraged, Ron. I think you could grow it. But the guy who does, that was my college freshman roommate. And after a lot of therapy and medication, he's doing well now. And truth be known, we were about the oddest couple roommates, maybe in college that year, that fall. And one of the things that I'd done was just really kind of nerdy computer guys before computers were really kind of in. And he just liked to make things, and he had the most obnoxious alarm clock made by any man. And he also liked it cold. And my favorite story is, one day I got up to go to the bathroom, you know how you can get up late at night, it's like 2 o'clock, and it is freezing. He liked it cold, and he had opened the window up, and we had a snowdrift between our beds. I mean, I stepped in snow, and so anyway, he survived his injuries, and but it's good to have him and his wife, Lorna, here. They actually started dating about 2 weeks after he got they started dating. So it was fun to be in love, not with Dawn, but with our soon-to-be wives and so. But it's good to have you here. We've been spending some time studying something that happened in the life of Jesus. It is something that Jesus did. It came out of who he was. It wasn't just his philosophy of life. It wasn't just conviction. It was indeed his heart. And it's something that he did like breathing. It came that natural to him. And it's something that Paul and the early church also embraced. And what they did, we're going to be talking about, what we've been talking about, is this way that they lived enabled them, drove them to create change and to influence others. And we're talking about that as a church. What does that mean for us individually? What does it mean for us corporately? And it comes out of a story. We're drawing some observations from an actual event that occurred in Jesus. And this is what it says in Luke 19, beginning with the first verse. Then Jesus entered and walked through Jericho, and there was a man there, his name was Zacchaeus, the head tax man and quite rich. He wanted desperately to see Jesus, but the crowd was in his way, for he was a short man and couldn't see over the crowd. So he ran on ahead and climbed up in a sycamore tree so he could see Jesus when Jesus came by. When Jesus got to the tree, and don't you understand, most of you know when you walk, you don't walk toward a tree. You walk around the tree. When you have a crowd, you don't walk toward the tree unless you're hoping to use it as a pick. You know, to take off some of those people that are tight walking with you. But Jesus walks right up to the tree and he looks up and he says, Zacchaeus, hurry down. Today is my day to be a guest in your home. I've had friends like that invite themselves over. Zacchaeus scrambled out of the tree, hardly believing his good luck, delighted to take Jesus home with him. And here's the piece I want you to catch. Everyone who saw this incident was indignant and groaned. What business does he, Jesus, have getting cozy with this crook? And Zacchaeus just stood there a little stunned. Again, this is something that happened in the life of Jesus. It's not a parable. It was not part of an evangelistic strategy or an outreach plan that Jesus had educated his disciples to follow and to embrace. And that he presented to his ministry team, and this would be a teaching moment. It's not that at all. It's simply how he lived every day. It just flowed naturally out of him. And it's from this actual occurrence that we are making some observations, drawing some principles about how the early church made a difference in their community, their culture, and indeed the world. And within 300 years, 3 centuries after Christ was crucified, they toppled the Roman Empire, which some would say was probably one of the greatest empires ever in the history of written history. But they toppled it. Even though it was just an ideology, they undercut it. And not only that, they trumped a religion that had been in place for over 2,000 years. And it's an amazing thing. They didn't set out to topple the Roman Empire. They didn't set out to trump Judaism. They just set out to live and breathe Jesus. And last week we looked at the first observation in this story, and it's this. We said Jesus and Paul leaned relationally in the direction of those they wanted to reach. There are a variety of ways that we expressed this last week. We said they built relational bridges, they extended the hand, they initiated conversations, they stepped toward, they tapped the shoulder. They valued whoever God brought across their path. They constantly, that's the word I want you to catch, they constantly leaned towards others. And this included the downtrodden, the hated, left out, looked over, pushed away, those who are on periphery of society, the sick, the have-nots, the left-outs, the didn't measure ups, the poor. They embraced whoever God brought across their path. Indeed, the very misfits and rejects of their culture. And I want you to catch this. Jesus and Paul stepped toward, leaned relationally toward the irreligious, non-religious, and sacrilegious of their culture. And again, we have a hard time doing that, do we not? In our culture. It's just easy. It's easy to be biased. It's easy to be racist. It's easy to take sides. It's easy to write somebody off, especially somebody who hurts us or doesn't agree with us. And we do that all the time without even thinking about it. The second observation rides on the shoulders of the first, and it's this, number two. And this is what I want to talk about today, and then there's a real short one, a third one I want to look at today. This is the second one. Jesus and Paul were not concerned about guilt by association. Guilt by association. Here's the deal. Do you guys remember being a teenager and you were getting ready to go out on the town on a Friday or Saturday night? Or maybe you got home really, really late. Or maybe you got home so late that mom and dad were up, but you knew what's going to come. Sometime sooner or later, whether you walked in the door or before you left out the door or the next morning when you got up, the Family Bureau of Investigation was going to sit down with you and give you a battery of questions that were expected almost every time you were out. And it was 3 questions with something like this. Where were you? What did you do? And the trump of all questions, who were you with? And we understand that. If you're a parent, you get that because you've done that. Why? Because we know the importance of having good friends and being around good people. We also know the old adage goes, birds of a feather flock together. Choose your friends with care. You become what they are. Or friends are like vacuum cleaners. You pick up their bad habits and that can really suck. And so if you're a parent, you always ask your kid these questions. Especially if in your small community you knew the playing field. The Bible says it this way, do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. Proverbs 24, don't envy bad people. Don't even want to be around them. All they think about is causing a disturbance, and all they talk about is making trouble. So we get that. I'm a parent of 4 kids. And Yvonne and I ask those questions often. Where were you? What did you do? Who are you with? I was a pastor of students for almost 25 years, and I was all over this. We taught this. You be careful who you associate with. There's old verse of the Proverbs as well. As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. The opposite of that is dull company dulls the blade. You know what I'm saying? And so I preached and harped on this to students, especially teenager adolescents, those who are entering those teenage years. Why? Because most teenagers are followers. Most teenagers are going to give in to peer pressure. It is a hard thing to stand alone. It's very few who can do that. It's easy for a group of students to talk one student into something. So we badger these questions. There's a tendency, as well as we know, for people to judge our child or a student on the basis of who they hang around. So when I share this little principle here, it's not something I would necessarily teach at a parenting seminar. It's definitely something that I probably would not share with students. Because we know that good kids can get in trouble when at the wrong place doing the wrong thing, with the impetus being the wrong people. But I do want you to get this. Jesus and Paul were not concerned about guilty by association. In fact, Jesus was charged with it often. Jesus didn't care what you thought about the people he hung around. But in Jesus' day, in the New Testament, there was a group of people who are fanatically concerned about guilt with association and being charged or have that charge levied against them. And they were the religious Pharisees, the religious elites. It was all about how they were perceived. It was all about not being with bad people because they would be contaminated. Whatever that word is. Did I just make up a word? And contaminated. Yay. And the bottom line was, they were so phobic about it that they wouldn't even be near or walk or talk or even make eye contact with somebody they thought didn't measure up to their standards. It's interesting if you think about all the times that Jesus has conflict with the Pharisees and how many times they actually dog him on this issue of who he associated with. I was thinking about that this morning. Some of the verses that came to mind were this one. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus, and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners," and I mean, it's almost like, can you believe it? Eats with them. Now, eats with them in that culture was a big deal because you ate with those that you considered family and friends, those who were closest to you. If you invited somebody to a meal, that was a sign of embracing and acceptance. It was a sign of solidarity. It was a sign of connectedness and tightness. So when he said he welcomes them, I mean, he's making eye contact, he's talking to them, he's actually giving them some value. But that's one thing, but oh my gosh, he actually eats with them. To share a table with somebody in that culture was an incredible compliment. Indeed, it valued them in your life. And by the way, that's Luke chapter 15. If this is your home, that's like my favorite scripture, my favorite passage in all the Bible, because Jesus comes back and he tells the parable of the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son. And it's a great story where he gives a glimpse about the heart of God and his heart as well. Another time in Luke 19, everyone who saw the incident, we just read this, was indignant and grumped. How could he give him any credibility? He who sold out his people for personal gain. Another one in Luke, and by the way, I love Luke. I love Luke because it's very blue collar, it's very earthy. It's one of those New Testament books, especially it's New Testament, the gospel. It's very fleshy, very earthly, very hands-on about faith. And in Luke 7, the Pharisee who had invited Jesus saw this, and if you remember what happened, is this woman of ill repute came in, had some perfume, and began to wash Jesus' feet. Remember that? Anoint them. And then she cried and wiped his feet with her hair. And the Pharisee says, if this man Jesus really were a prophet, he would know what kind of woman is touching him. Oh my gosh, worse than cooties. He would know that she is a sinner. That's a tag he didn't want to get in that culture. I can't think of a worse word to be called a sinner in that culture. It's ugly. It begs you, tags you, it casts you out, it pushes you to the perimeter. It says not worthy, unwelcome, doesn't fit, doesn't belong. In Matthew 11, this is one of the things that they charge Jesus with. Boy, if you just knew my family situation, you'd understand. This is one of those words that's very, very interesting. But the Son of Man, Jesus, goes around eating and drinking. Another translation said he's a glutton and a drunkard. I came from a family that doesn't believe in drinking. They didn't believe that Jesus ever drank. And the reason I think this is so funny is because he drank wine. Okay, it's not like they stuck it in the fridge. And if Jesus told, remember the parable of the wineskins. You don't put new wine in an old wineskin. Why? Because it expands when it ferments. Okay? So they called him a drunkard and a glutton. It means that he was always walking around with a drink in one hand and a sandwich in the other, chatting with those people who were sinners. Alright? And it goes on to say, and if that's not bad enough, he is even a friend of tax collectors, and again the word sinners. Alright? So I want you to understand the criticism here is waged in this age-old mentality that you are guilty by association. You hung around those kind of people because Jesus, at your core, you are one of those people. And when you say one of those people, when somebody says you're one of those people, they're telling you on the other side, I ain't, and you is. It's a degrading, it's a condescending way of telling somebody, I am more than you. Guilt by association. We've said the last 2 weeks that there are churches that tend to have lists. And there's lists of what you're to do and what you're not to do. But the interesting thing is, I grew up in the church. I'm a third generation pastor. What was I thinking? And the bottom line is, I'm a third generation pastor. And one of the things that I've seen is churches that have lists usually have two sets of lists, a to-do list and not to-do list. But you never see the to-do list. The emphasis and the priority is put on what not to do. And we talked about that the last couple weeks. A lot of times what makes it really tough is you don't know what the to-do list is because the church has families that have been there for 1, 2, or 3 generations. And they know the list, you don't know the list. And if you want to belong to that church and be on the inside, you better learn what's not written on the list. And if they have a list, you better find that list too. Because right away, you're going to find out you don't belong here. We were in a church once, and I shared this story more back a few months ago, and we had this kid his name was Tony. He was on the edge. He has an earring. Now the reason I say that is because this was in the 80s when earrings and tattoos were just a little wild side, okay? And so he came to church wearing jeans. He didn't have a tie or a coat. This is no. I'm not going to say. I don't want to name it. Because if I said Baptist, you kind of have a different... but it was one of those churches, Baptist, and he didn't have a coat, didn't have a tie, he's wearing tennis shoes, jeans, and he had an earring and a tattoo you could see below his sleeve. And one of our people went up to him. He had been gone for 3 or 4 years. He had made some bad choices, but he was coming back. And indeed, he's actually in the ministry now. And Tony comes in, and this guy comes up to him and said, Tony, yeah, you'll be welcome back here when you go home and get a tie, get rid of that earring, and cover up that tattoo. Now, none of those things were on our list. But it was on his list. And when Tony heard that day in his home church that he was coming back to after being the prodigal son was, you don't belong here yet. And that's what lists do. They say, the list is basically this. You can join us when you're like us, but until you're like us, we'll preach at you. And that's how it's going to work. And we talked about that. You know, when we confront somebody, and we've got to be very careful, when we come to somebody, we get into their life, and we have permission to talk and speak into their life, we better earn the right to be heard. Okay? But it's not a shaming thing. Shame and guilt makes people conform without heart change. But change that comes from God comes from the heart, and it's conviction, and goes on the inside out. And sometimes we think we're God and we're the Holy Spirit. And we're out of line. And my dad used to say, if it doesn't hurt you to speak to them, keep your mouth shut. It is a reality in religious systems. In too many churches, when lists do more than anything else, they draw a line in the sand. They separate to define. They tell us who's in and who's not. They tell us you belong and you don't. And so, how does that happen? How does that happen? Now, just before we start this, if I sound like I'm really condescending, I'm really preaching, it's because I've been there. I've had my list. I know none of you would ever do that, but I've had my list. And I've had people walk into our church and go, biz bag, straight to hell, do not pass go, do not collect $200. I have done that. Makes me sad. How many of you have ever gotten wounded like that by a believer or a church? Anybody? Yeah. How about this? How many of you have ever given wounds like that? Yeah. How does that happen? I'm reading a book right now. It's really amazing to me that sometimes I'm reading books and then it dovetails exactly what into we're talking about. And the book is written by Tim Keller. It's called A Reason for God. And if you're a person who likes to think through your faith and not just apologetically defend your faith, but to think through philosophy and ideology and the culture that we live in that's just rampant with it, you will love his stuff. and he's just one of these guys who loves to talk to people who disagree with him because he finds it wonderfully challenging, and he has this incredible way of embracing and affirming those he disagrees with. Okay? And he answers that question, how does that happen? And this is what he says. And I'm going to try and read it to you. It says, many people view the Christian faith as a form of moral improvement. If that were true, then intense Christians would therefore be intense moralists, or as they were called in Jesus' day, Pharisees. Pharisaic people assume they are right with God because they have the right doctrine and the right moral behavior. This inevitably and naturally leads to feelings of superiority toward those who do not share their religiosity. I love that phrase. It has so many big words in it. Gotta learn those words for Scrabble. And from these various forms from those, what happens? There are various forms of abuse, exclusion, and oppression. This is the essence, he says, of what we think of fanaticism. Okay? Because a fanatic is better than you. And a fanatic needs to fix you, you see, because you're not like them. It's very condescending. But here's what he says, I find this brilliant. He says, what if, however, the essence of Christianity is salvation by grace? Not salvation because of what we do, but because of what Christ has done for us. If we operate from that frame of reference, he said, you are basically embracing that you are accepted by God by sheer grace. That means you have the absolute awareness and conviction that you bring nothing to the table that deserves God's goodness. There is nothing about you that earns God's favor. And to understand that, to embrace that, he said, is profoundly humbling. It's interesting, in Corinthians it says this, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Okay? And so, really, if we understand this, the more we understand grace, the more humble we are. The more we understand grace, the more we appreciate people and value who they are. The more we understand grace, we realize I didn't come to this on my own. It wasn't like I all of a sudden intellectually thought the student said this will make me a better person. It wasn't the discipline of just putting myself through some religious vigor that makes me acceptable to God. I come to God totally dependent upon grace. So we're all on the same level playing field. I got nothing on anybody. That means I'm no better than you. Guy just met the big trip. No better than Cassie. I'm no better than sorry, I forgot her name. But anyway, friends. So I just messed with you. But I'm no better than you. I can't go into this thinking I'm better. Why? Because God embraced me on the basis of grace. Therefore, people who are fanatics, then, listen, this is so brilliant. I wish I put this on the slide. People who are fanatics, then, are fanatics. So, not because they're committed to the gospel, but because they're not committed to it enough. Did you catch that? People who are fanatics are committed to the gospel, but not committed enough, because they don't totally get it. Religion always makes somebody feel better than somebody else. Because religion is about me, but grace is about Jesus. You see what I'm saying? It removes that element. Think of people you consider fanatical. Are they not harsh, insensitive, judgmental, opinionated, overbearing, and self-righteous? All those wonderful qualities you want to embrace? No, or knock out. It's not because they are too Christian, but because they're not Christian enough. They're fanatically zealous and very courageous. There used to be these guys that used to carry this white cross down at the theater. You know, listen, I'm a believer, and I'm not saying they're not believers. But there are times where I was like, whew. You want dark sunglasses, you're just embarrassed, especially if you're with people you're trying to influence and you're trying to explain that. And they're very courageous. No, they're very offensive. He goes on to say, but they are not fanatically empathetic, forgiving, humble, sensitive, and understanding like Jesus. They know enough about Jesus to be dangerous, but not enough to have changed their hearts. Why? Because they think of Christianity as a self-improvement program. They love the Jesus with the whips in the temple. That is so awesome, okay? But not the Jesus who said, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Sin is the unifying factor, by the way. It's the common denominator. It is the level playing field that we all come to Jesus on. So we got nothing on anyone. It makes it all level. No one comes to Jesus because they're a little bit better. Some of you have been walking with Jesus for a long time. Okay, I just want to say this. You've been walking with Jesus for a long time, and maybe you came to Christ at a young age, and so your closet of regret, your trunk of mistakes is not very big. You've done life pretty well. But you came to Jesus by grace. And some of you here maybe haven't come to Jesus at all, and you're still in that process. We're totally cool about you taking your time and thinking it through. We talk about RiverTree being a place that gives people grace, space, and time just to think it through. Alright? But if you're here and you've never asked Jesus into your life and you have a boatload of regret, you have a closet of stuff that you definitely don't even like to acknowledge, you would hate for anybody else to know. You have thick books of mistakes and hard things and hurt that you've done. Did you know if you come to Christ, if you come to Christ and you ask Jesus to come in your life today, you are on the same playing field as a person who's almost lived I won't say a perfect life, but has done pretty good. And that person who's done pretty good has nothing on you. The only reason they're where they're at is because Jesus embraced them with grace. But we have that sensitivity, the idea that there's a pecking order that exists that makes one person better than the other. And it kills us. It kills the movement. It kills Jesus being able to work in other people's lives because we think we're better. You never, I just want you to know, you never find Jesus worried about guilt by association. Never. And when that line existed, if that line existed, and it did exist, Jesus just would walk all over the lines. Over and over again, the question that Jesus is asked by the Pharisees is this. I want you to understand. Jesus got a question for him, like totally hanging out with tax collectors. Are you saying it's okay to cheat people? Or Jesus dude, man, I got a question for you, man. Jesus, if are you saying it's okay to sell your own people out for drag? I mean, Jesus, are you saying it's okay to be selfish and it's okay for him to have done what he's done and hurt the people he's hurt and walk away on his family and backstab his own people to be rich? Are you saying that's okay? Because just by being with him, Jesus, I think you're saying that. That's what they're saying. That's why they're really ticked to Jesus. Yes, we hate him. Yes, we do. Yes, we hate him. How about you? That's what they're doing. It's that cheer. By hanging out with sinners, are you telling them that it's okay to sin? Is it okay to, and fill in the blank whatever it is, the sin that you hate the most, that you're not guilty of, that makes it easy for you to judge others who struggle with that sin? Are you condoning it? It's really interesting to me when you think that. Just think that for a minute. Jesus is hearing these questions, are you condoning sin? And Jesus is like, you have no idea. I'm going to be nailed to the cross because of sin. You're bent out of shape that I'm with sinners, and I am here to save sinners. I am here, in fact, to help them find forgiveness of sin. And you're asking me, the chief of sinners, you, because of your pride and your thinking you're better than that, and better than this, and better than this person, because of how moral you are, and yet your hearts are dirty. They're empty. You claim to be working for a God that you don't even know. Sin ultimately would have Jesus nailed to the cross. But one thing Jesus would say, and he did say without saying it directly, is this: I could care less about what you think about who I hang out with, because people matter to me. And that leads to this final observation, and it's just a one-liner, a couple of thoughts is all. And this one you're going to love, especially if you're a goofy liberal Democrat. Now, some of you know we joke about that kind of stuff here, okay? Jesus and Paul were constantly at odds with the religious right. I just think that's so funny to me. And I got that from Andy Stanley, but I just think that's so funny. And the reason I say that is the religious right thinks they're right and they're better. Now, if you're a Democrat, you do, but you're on the other side of the coin. I also want you to realize, I don't think Jesus would claim to be either. I don't think he'd flip and even care. You got it right? Vote. Now let's talk about what really matters, because in the next life, it don't matter. All those times we talked about in the last couple of weeks is he was always asked to get into the debate about the Roman Empire. And they were a godless, harsh, oppressive, evil, relentless empire, and Jesus didn't touch it. Give to Caesar what is Caesar, give to God what is God's. Now let's talk about what matters. He did that all the time, okay? And it's important for us. Here's why I want you to really get from this. This is the part to me I just think is so fascinating. If you took Jesus and you took him into a room, and you put him, you know, like you have in your high school, you have your individual desks, okay? And you put Jesus and Paul in a room, and they got their desks, and then you surround them by a whole bunch of Pharisees and Sadducees and the Sanhedrin and the teachers of the law and all the other things they call them in the New Testament. And you put them in there, and then you give them a blank sheet of paper, and you say, okay, here's the test for you guys. You're all going to take a test. And what I want you to do is I want you to write down the dozen most important things about your faith. They're non-negotiable. You know what's really crazy? They would line up almost exact. I want you to think of that. Just hold on here. They would line up on doctrinal issues almost exact, spot on. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. There is one God, you serve him only. No false idols. They would go through all the 10, the commandments would probably be up there in the top 10. And you put them, you get their papers together, and you compare them, and you go, they're all on the same page, but why aren't they on the same page? Well, they total agreement on doctrine, but not approach. Total agreement on doctrine, but they forgot this issue that Jesus said, here's the greatest commandment. Remember it? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And they missed it. Jesus and Paul were constantly at odds with those that they theologically agreed with most. Do you see that? So I just want you to know, some of the most ugly arguments I've been involved in are theology. Now, I'd love to go into theology a little bit. And I'm not that astute, okay? Really not. I wish I could say I have a PhD. I don't know if it means anything, but I'm not theologically astute. In my family, most of you know, I have 4 kids. 3 are in ministry, 2 are full-time, 1's doing worship. And those 3 guys, my son Aaron, my twins, Jake and Josh, they get in arguments. And out of all the kids, I think Yvonne would agree, my son Josh is probably the most astute. And maybe the most loving, the most, who always say, we can find common ground, and probably, I don't want to say most gracious, because all of them practice grace. But I want you to know some of the blows I've taken, and I'll just say this, are from Calvinists. I don't know why Calvinists are always mad. But they just seem always mad, always want to hit somebody. I don't get that, okay? John's got an answer. A friend of mine, John, would like to. But why is that? I don't know. But I will tell you this. Jesus is saying, if theology doesn't translate into loving God and loving your neighbor, it's not theology, because it's not God. And the thing we need to realize is Jesus did not care about guilt by association. He did not align himself with religious right. And he always, always, always reached out and embraced whoever crossed his path. Indeed, in a society where sinners were bagged and tagged, and some people were labeled in such a way they would never ever get out of the hole that they were placed in, those very people who were considered the worst of society were drawn to Jesus like a magnet. He who was God in the flesh, who was without sin, drew sinners to him like a magnet. And the people who were repulsed by him were those who were most religious and theologically narrow. It's an oxymoron. It's very difficult to understand. So here's what I want you to think about today. Just as, what do you do with that? I don't know. I didn't take the time to write it up. No conclusion. Let you make your own conclusion anyway. Okay? But the bottom line, we need to ask ourselves, God, I just say, Jesus, number one, do I know you? Have I trusted you? And then secondly, what have I done with that? Does it show up in the way I treat people and love people that God brings across my path every day? At work, on the street, in the marketplace, at school, in our homes? Do they get the grace? The grace indeed that we got, that changes. Let's pray. Hey God, it's just simple stuff, and I get irritated mostly because I've been on the other side of the line. I've loved to preach against. I've loved to point fingers. I've loved to feel better about myself and feel like I'm all that in a bag of chips. And yet the bottom line is I'm nothing without you. I am nothing without grace. And you still embrace me even when I'm a dork to this day. And I thank you for stepping towards me. And I pray that we would be, and that I would be, a person who steps towards others as well. To embrace them wherever they're at, regardless of the response. Because that's the way you call us to love and live. In this little thing we call life. And it's Christ I pray. Amen.